We're here this evening to talk about the subject of suicide, which is one that is rather sadly associated with, I think, Japan more than most countries. I don't know what our speakers are going to say about it, but I imagine that we will find out that there is, to some extent, that attitudes towards suicide are to some extent culturally and perhaps religiously determined, but we'll see. So I'll just briefly introduce our two speakers. So we have Dr. Satoshi Kodama, and he is Associate Professor at the Department of Ethics at Kyoto University Graduate School of Letters. So his background is in moral and political philosophy, and he previously was at the Department of Biomedical Ethics at the University of Tokyo Graduate School of Medicine. And he's written various books and so on, but I won't list them all here. And then our second speaker will be Professor Richard Huxtable. He's Professor of Medical Ethics and Law and Director of the Centre for Ethics in Medicine at Bristol University in the medical school there. And so he specialises in healthcare ethics particularly. And again, he's written various things, but I won't go through them all now. He can tell you about them himself if he'd like to later on. So let's start with Dr. Kodama.
Okay. First of all, I thank Miss Nanaota and Jason Dyer Foundation for inviting me to give a talk today. I also thank you all for coming today. My name is Satoshi Kodama, and I teach at Kyoto University. And today's topic is the ethics of my topic is ethics of suicide prevention. This is rather serious topic, but I hope we can enjoy discussing the topic. And let me briefly introduce myself. As already mentioned, I'm now an Associate Professor of Ethics at Kyoto University Graduate School of Letters. Initially, my main research interest was about the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham. Perhaps many of you know that his mummified body, or old icon in his words, sits quietly in the corridor of University College London, which is not too far from here. I studied there for 1 year back in year 2000. And I was formerly a lecturer of biomedical ethics at the University of Tokyo Graduate School of Medicine, where I researched many bioethical topics, including brain death, euthanasia, and public health ethics, because I belong to the School of Public Health Ethics, public health then. I continue my research on end-of-life issues, notably with Professor Richard Huxtable here. That's how I got interested in assisted suicide and also suicide as a public health issue. Currently, but I have to say, I'm not exactly an expert on public suicide or suicide prevention. My main interest, I'm a philosopher, and from that angle, I do research on public suicide. But currently, I am an academic visitor at Oxford Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics. I enjoy Oxford very much, but my family and I will have to go back to Japan next month. Hopefully, I think. So this is the outline of my talk. First, I will talk about suicide and suicide prevention in Japan, what's happening in Japan, and then I will make short kind of philosophical musings about suicide. I think suicide is unique in that it is not exactly a disease, nor it is not exactly a crime any longer in the UK, or not crime in Japan in any time. But it's nevertheless associated with disease and crime. And third and last, I will discuss two ethical questions in relation to suicide prevention. One is whether suicide is always a bad idea and something that should be discouraged. And the other is whether physician-assisted dying or physician-assisted suicide is a form of suicide. So a lot of things to say, so I will go quickly. So first, about suicide prevention in Japan. So this is an international comparison of suicide rates in some developed countries. I don't know why this report picked these particular countries, but on the very left side we have Japan, and the second last on the right side we have UK. So the statistics is slightly old, but in 2015 the total suicide rate for Japan was 18.5 suicides per 100,000 people, whereas that for the UK was 7.5 per 100,000. Now it's, I think the UK is increasing, but the pink bar is for the male suicide rate, and the blue bar is for female. By the way, representing male in the pink bar and female in the blue bar is quite politically correct, I think. Yes. You can see that men commit suicide for far more than women do in almost, I think, every country. And about history, the first major suicide prevention started in Japan when Christian groups set up what's called Telephone of Life, Inochi no Denwa, in 1971. So they listened to the callers who have suicidal thoughts and gave advice. They modeled their practice on the Samaritans in the UK, and a similar non-governmental group in the then West Germany. Now, this is a photo I took at Science Museum in London. That's a great museum, by the way. As you may know, the Samaritans was founded by the vicar called Chad Vara in 1953 in London. And should you feel suicidal either during or after my talk, please do not hesitate to call this number or email joe@samaritan.org. Okay. Yes. Anyway, the Telephone of Life was non-governmental initiative. The Japanese government didn't do much in the way of preventing suicide until 1998, when the annual number of suicides shot up by more than 8,500 to reach almost 33,000 suicides. That's 26.0 suicide per 100,000. It's quite big number. And one of the reasons behind this increase was the economic downturn, epitomized by the liquidation of one of the biggest investing companies in Japan at the end of 1997. Yamaichi Shoken, Yamaichi Investing Company, which was soon followed by bankruptcies of several local banks or prefectural banks. Yes. Okay. Oh, sorry. Because of the sharp rise in the number of suicides, the government had to do something about this. And after 8 years, Japan's National Diet enacted the Basic Act of Suicide Prevention. It used to be that the Ministry of Health, Welfare, Labor, here mentioned as Ministry of Health, but it used to be that this Ministry of Health took the charge of suicide prevention because of suicide was mainly associated with mental health problems. But the Act made the Cabinet Office in charge of coordinating suicide prevention among many ministries and agencies. The Act also ordered that there be a new Minister of State for Suicide Prevention. It also mandated that there be general principles of suicide prevention policy, meaning that many policies concerning suicide prevention among many ministries and agencies should be well coordinated among the ministries and across the nation. The act explicitly employ the primary, secondary, tertiary prevention model, which is often used in public health and also crime prevention. So by taking the public health approach, the act emphasized that suicide is not only personal issue, but also social issue that needs to be addressed by the local and the central government. Incidentally, the UK also created Suicide Prevention Minister in 2018. This might not exactly the Suicide Prevention Minister, but this person, Jackie Dole Price, was the first minister under Theresa May's government. Now it's, I think, Nadine Dorries. Right. So after the enactment and enforcement of the Basic Act of Suicide Prevention in 2006, there was a steady decrease of suicide in Japan since 2010. Not only the number of suicide has decreased, but also the suicide rate has steadily decreased. So last year in 2019, the number of suicide has decreased just below 20,000, and the suicide rate is now stands 15.8 per 100,000. And the Japanese government is aiming to lower it further to below. So this is the current number, I think, the available number. And the government is aiming lower it further to below 16,000 or 13.0 per 100,000 by 2026. Whether this will happen in 6 years' time, we have to watch this space. Again, for the sake of comparison, there was about 6,500 suicides across the UK, all of the UK. That is 11.2 per suicides per 100,000 people. You can see the UK's suicide rate is still much lower than that of Japan, although there's a worrying increase in the UK, as I think Richard will also mention. Quickly, next I will move on to the second section of my talk, a bit about philosophy or kind of conceptual issues about suicide. So perhaps I may be stating the obvious, but suicide has a very unique relationship with disease and crime. First, suicide is not a disease. It is certainly a cause of death, recognized as such in Japan, and sometimes a result of mental health issues. It is also sometimes considered as contagious, as I will mention later, but it's not itself a disease. So suicide has relations with medical issues, but I call it kind of quasi-medical issue. And second, suicide is not a crime either, at least in many countries, including the UK and Japan. It was, I think, 1961 that UK changed suicide act to decriminalize suicide. But assistance in suicide often constitutes crime in many countries, including the UK and Japan. So assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide is illegal in Japan, as in UK. And unlike crimes like murder, suicide is committed by oneself and so has no obvious offender. But still, the police has to investigate a suspicious death in order to decide whether it's suicide or murder. So if we see a dead body here, the police have to investigate if it's caused by accident or suicide or murder. In that sense, suicide is it's not crime, but it's related to crime, so has a kind of quasi-criminal aspect. And I think this kind of characteristic of suicide is very, for me, it's very interesting to think about this implication of how we prevent suicide. And there is an issue of stigmatization. I often wonder why suicide is so stigmatized in Japan or other countries. But one reason being, I think it's related to mental health issues, which is also stigmatized. But part of the answer seems that unlike diseases like cancer or crimes like murder, suicide has no obvious external causes which we can blame on. Hence, the victim and the family or friends are likely to be blamed for being weak or not doing enough to help the victim. In this context, there's a really nice non-fiction book in Japan. I think it's just in Japanese, but called I Couldn't Tell Them It Was Suicide. This book is written by those youngsters who lost mainly their father by suicide in the period of economic downturn of the late 1990s in Japan. So in one very heartbreaking story, the teenager writes that his mother told him, don't tell anybody about your father's suicide, otherwise you wouldn't be able to get a job or get married. This is quite very sad comment from the mother who herself lost her husband. But I suppose this kind of stigmatization still persists in Japan. Sorry. So I said suicide is not a disease, but sometimes it acts like a contagious disease. This is a problem known as imitation suicide, or I don't know how you say it in English. Is that Werther? It's in Japanese. It's Werther. It's yes, Werther effect. After the heroine get this sorrow of young Werther, but who shot himself in the head after the breakup of a relationship. So some young people, after the publication of the book in the European countries, committed suicide, and the book was banned in several countries at that time. So imitation suicide is well recognized in the field of suicide prevention, and the World Health Organization has issued the guidance called Preventing Suicide. This is the latest revised one, but in 2017. But in which WHO lists do's and don'ts when reporting suicide on the media. I will come back to this issue later in the last section. Okay. So the last section discussed two ethical questions. Is suicide always bad? And is physician-assisted dying a form of suicide? So the first question is whether suicide is always a bad idea. I would like to answer this question by using several real-life cases. The first case is this, the case of Matsuri Takahashi. Some of you may know this case. So she was a promising young lady working for one of the best-known public relations company, which is Dentsu, if you know. So she, after graduating from the University of Tokyo 1 year ago. So she suffered from depression caused by working long hours. When you say long hours in Japan, it can be very, very long. For example, 2 months before her death, she was in the office for 53 hours, not being able to go back home to sleep. So then she threw herself to death from her apartment building in the morning of Christmas Day in 2015. That's very sad, I think. But she was 24. So after her death, she or her family, she or I think her family was awarded workers' compensation, and the company was found in violation of the labor standards law. So was this suicide a bad idea? In other words, are we justified in preventing her from committing suicide? That's an ethical question that I'm quite interested in. I will come back to this case later. Yes, so I have to be quick, sorry. The second case is the suicide of Susumu Nishibe. This is a philosopher and a public intellectual in Japan. So he killed himself by drowning in Tama River in Tokyo, which is very famous for killing them, suicide, I think. So January 2018, that was January 2018, he was 78. I didn't know him personally, but because he was a really good friend of my former supervisor, I was quite shocked to know his suicide. So this philosopher was a vocal advocate of suicide, disliking the idea of dying at hospital. And at the time of death, he wasn't in any sense terminal. But the accumulated damage in his spine meant that he no longer had control over his hands, and thus he was unable to write. And he lost his wife 4 years before his death, after caring her for 8 years. And because he couldn't kill himself with his disabled hands, 2 young friends of his helped him die in the river. And they were later found guilty of assisting suicide, or was it abetting suicide, assisting suicide. Now, was this suicide a bad idea? Again, in other words, are we justified in preventing him from committing suicide? Or rather, were his friends justified in helping him to commit suicide? Morally speaking, legally they were guilty of assisting suicide. The last case is that of Brittany Maynard. This is not about Japan, from California. As is written here, she was 29 years old when she found that she had a very serious form of brain cancer, which meant she will die in 6 months. She and her family decided to move to the state of Oregon, where physician-assisted dying or death with dignity is lawful for terminal patients like her. So she didn't like to die on a hospital bed. Rather, she wanted to die at home, surrounded by her close family and friends. And that's what she did on the first day of November 2014, after putting short videos on YouTube saying that she will die on that day. And she wanted to promote the idea of physician-assisted dying. And after her death, the state of California became one of the states allowing physician-assisted dying. Now, again, was this suicide a bad idea in her case? In other words, are we justified in preventing her from committing suicide? Or rather, were her family and her doctor justified in helping her to commit suicide, morally speaking? So these are questions I'm quite interested in, and my short answer is this one is I have to explain later. I think I don't have much time, but short answer is I'm not blaming them at all. But I think this is if we have some other way, alternative way to end suffering rather than killing themselves. I think it's always a bad idea to commit suicide. And so these cases, I think there was some other better way than killing themselves. But this is, I think, is not a bad idea. So physician-assisted suicide in certain circumstances, I think it is justified they are justified to commit suicide. But I can discuss this case later, perhaps in discussion time. And quickly, I should address the second question: is physician-assisted dying or PAD a form of suicide? And my answer is yes. So my position is answer A. That not every suicide is bad. I think there is a kind of reasonable reason to commit suicide. And physician-assisted dying is acceptable because it is suicide, but a reasonable one, as in the case of Brittany Maynard. But there is another way to answer this. There are several other ways, but another way is answer B, which says every suicide is bad, but physician-assisted dying is actually not suicide, so it is acceptable. So I will show the example of this claim. But so I would like to argue that answer B is not a tenable position. So this is the American from statement made by American Association of Suicidology as its position statement in 2017, saying that suicide is not the same as physician aid in dying. I quote, American Association of Suicidology recognizes that the practice of physician aid in dying is distinct from the behavior that has been traditionally and ordinarily described as suicide. The tragic event our organization works so hard to prevent. The two practices can, in principle, be conceptually distinguished, and the professional obligations of those involved in suicide prevention may differ. This is essentially, again, answer B in the previous slide, namely every suicide is bad and should be prevented, while physician-assisted dying is acceptable because it is not suicide. Now, one can define words as one pleases, but saying physician-assisted dying is not a form of suicide can have inconvenient consequences, as I explained the last couple of slides. So this is another example from Japan. So last year NHK, Japanese counterpart of the BBC, but I would say it's not as good as BBC. It doesn't have the archers. So they aired a documentary on suicide tourism. The female patient here, she's dying in Switzerland actually, was diagnosed as multiple system atrophy, which is when she was 48 years old. Multiple system atrophy is a nervous system disorder whose symptoms are similar to Parkinson's disease. It's a progressive disease, and currently there's no cure. So usually they will die in 8, 9, 10 years. So she decided to commit suicide, but since physician-assisted dying is illegal in Japan, she flew over to Switzerland when she was 52 and died there, surrounded by her sisters. The moment of death was shown on the documentary. It was quite shocking for the Japanese public, and of course there were several complaints. And yes. So this is a statement from disability group in Japan. So one disability group, which is active in Kyoto, actually, made a formal complaint to NHK saying that the documentary violated the WHO's guidance on suicide reporting. It said the patient's death in the documentary was suicide, in which the patient herself started the intravenous drip of lethal drug prescribed by a doctor. The broadcasting of the very act of suicide carries a serious problem in terms of media ethics and suicide prevention. And according to the WHO's Preventing Suicide, this guidance, media professionals must observe certain rules, and the NHK must have known them, but none of the rules were followed. Now, I think what's interesting, I think, is this statement. In this statement, is that it assumes physician-assisted dying is actually a form of suicide, and I find it quite natural to do so. But if the American Society of Suicidology is correct, we cannot blame NHK for breaching the WHO's guidance on suicide reporting, because physician-assisted dying is not suicide. In passing, the BBC aired a similar kind of documentaries on suicide tourism in 2011 and again in 2016. I think you have many more people who go to Switzerland to die, and you are way ahead of Japan in that sense. And they also face similar complaints from advocacy groups like Care Not Killing. Exactly kind of similar complaints using WHO's guidance on media reporting. So, sorry, I will quickly finish. This is what the WHO says about don'ts of suicide reporting. I think a lot of them, I won't read this, but like don't explicitly describe the method used, don't provide details about the site and location. I think a lot of them apply to physician-assisted suicide, like the one in that NHK broadcasted. And it's hard to believe that the disability group is conceptually mistaken to think, to say that the documentary was in breach of WHO's guideline. So in sum, I don't think it's a good idea to conceptually distinguish suicide and physician-assisted dying and say physician-assisted dying is not suicide. Physician-assisted dying is, I think, suicide, but is an acceptable form of suicide when it meets requirements set forth by the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, for example. I know it's illegal in here, but just say suicide, physician-assisted dying is sometimes illegal in several countries. So conclusions. So generalized suicide attempts are not a good idea, and we should try to prevent them. And Japan's government is doing a fairly good work. An important ethical question is whether all suicides are bad and we should prevent them, or some suicides are reasonable and we should rather help them if we can in an ethical manner. An important conceptual question again is whether physician-assisted dying is a suicide. This relates to practical question of whether the WHO's media guidance on reporting suicide applies to the media coverage of suicide tourism or physician-assisted dying in general. So thank you for listening. Thank you.
Bless you. Wonderful, thank you. And thank you indeed to the Foundation and to Kodama Sensei for the invitation and a warm welcome, and thank you all for coming along this evening. Much like Satoshi, I work predominantly in healthcare, or more narrowly, medical ethics and law in Bristol, as was mentioned at the outset. So I will start, like Satoshi, I will start with some facts and figures, rehearsing some of the facts and figures Satoshi's provided, but I'll move quite quickly to some of the central ethical questions as they arise particularly for clinicians and, if you like, patients in a UK setting. And I'm going to provide you with two cases, and rather in keeping with Satoshi, I'll also have three phases to what I'll talk about. But unlike Satoshi, I'm not going to give you any answers, I'm just going to ask you difficult questions. And then I'm going to, with your permission, ask you to vote on what you think is ethically the appropriate thing to do in relation to two of the cases. And then, during questions, we can discuss anything you'd like to say about those cases. Okay, so hopefully you're happy to vote, but we will see. We'll get there in a moment. So I'll begin with some thanks and acknowledgements and a caveat indeed. Thanks to a colleague, Paul Teed, who is a medical doctor at Bristol, undertaking a PhD, in fact, in relation to assisted suicide and this phenomenon of assisted suicide travel, and what are the responsibilities of medical professionals when they know their patients are looking to travel. So he's advised me here, but so too have a range of colleagues from Bristol and Manchester University. Both have very big groups looking at suicide and self-harm generally. And I was pleased to work with colleagues in Manchester and Bristol on a programme of research funded by the National Institute for Health Research a few years back. And I'll draw on some of that research later on. But I should strongly say the views I express are not those of the people named here or of the funder. And in fact, the views will be yours because you'll be the one providing the answers. Good. So here's the plan. I'll start, as I say, with a brief picture of the epidemiology, if you like. Much of this Satoshi has nicely covered. I'll then move to what I think is one of the central ethical questions here. And it's implicit in my subtitle. I'm asking, how ethically we navigate two potentially competing sets of values. One signalling the importance of protecting and respecting life, but the other signalling the importance of respecting individual choice in at least some cases. How do we navigate between those two values, and indeed can a balance be struck between them? And those will emerge during my complex cases. So starting then, just to rehearse very briefly this time some of the facts and figures. We've already heard this is from the World Health Organization, slightly older than some of the statistics Satoshi had. We had, for every 100,000 members of the population in the UK back in 2016, according to the World Health Organization, 11.9 per 100,000 were committing suicide. Now I immediately pause there because that language is clumsy and is a legal hangover, if you like. We talk about crimes being committed, but of course suicide, as Satoshi's mentioned, in England and Wales certainly, and the UK more broadly, is not a crime. So there's something to be done there around the language we use, so apologies if I do slip into talking about committing suicide. But 11.9 in 2016 for the UK, compared with 20.5 in Japan. But we note that with Japan it has significantly come down, and there are these aspirations to bring that figure down further. So it's already down to 15.8 in 2019. But if we look to the UK, this time data from the Office of National Statistics, not the World Health Organization, so the figures are slightly different. It's noticeable that on average across genders we're talking about 11.2 in 2018, many more men than women. And what's been noted generally about the picture of suicide in this country, or these grouped countries, the UK, there has been this gradual decline since the 1980s, and then a recent trend of further decline since around about 2013. But the 2018 data suggests things are on the rise again. So there is a perceived problem to address here. In terms of who the individuals are, it seems certainly middle age, certainly men, and there are some concerns about younger people as well, under the age of 25. Those seem to be groups that are vulnerable or susceptible, depending on how you wish to describe it. Methods I will briefly mention. It seems strikingly similar to Japan. The primary methods involve hanging, suffocation, or strangulation, with poisoning as a lower down secondary method. So what are the responses to this? Well, I won't dwell on this in great detail, and in fact it would be other colleagues, including from those teams elsewhere in Bristol and Manchester, and indeed a team in Oxford that has national expertise here. But there have been policy drives seeking to address suicide and indeed to prevent suicide. So reports such as this one from the government about various action points, and there are 6 actions listed there. I won't talk about them here, but I will point out 3 of the groups in particular that are being targeted presently in terms of these suicide prevention efforts. The first is broadly we're talking about individuals in mental health, community and treatment settings. So mental health and suicide, there's a link or a perceived link. This seems to be a group that's at risk, so there are policy drives there. Secondly, we have, referring back to those data suggesting that younger people seem to be an increasingly at-risk group, there are drives to safeguard and address suicide and indeed self-harm amongst younger people. And then thirdly, there are efforts to address men, and in particular middle-aged men, who seem to be a group particularly at risk, if that's the language you choose to use. So very much a drive in the direction of prevention. And underneath that, I think, is a bundle of ethical values. You could express what I'm about to say in terms of protecting the welfare of individuals, in terms of notions like solidarity and looking out for the most vulnerable members of our society. But broadly, underpinning it, there's some sort of idea that life is valuable and life merits protection. And we should be stopping people from ending their own lives, and indeed from other people ending people's lives. So on the one side, we do have this clear set of ethical messages around the importance of and the value of life itself. And you can express this in lots of different ways, as I just mentioned. It may be, going back to the introduction, there is some broadly religious undertones to the position we currently have in this country, certainly when you look to law. So we have scholars like Professor John Keown, who actually works in the US but writes predominantly about the position in England and Wales. And he notes that reflecting the fundamental principle of the sanctity or inviolability of life, the goal of the law has long been to discourage suicide, assisted suicide, and murder. Suicide was decriminalised in 1961, but he signals that this is no way a condemnation. It's not saying suicide is something we approve of in some sense. Rather, the whole tenor of the law is still designed to stop people taking their own lives or the lives of others. And we can come back to that idea of whether there's a right to commit suicide later, if you like, during questions. But on the one side, we certainly have this clear ethical message of protection and protecting life. But the tension arises, particularly if we look again, the ideas here can be expressed in lots of different ways. We can talk about notions like dignity, self-determination, or autonomy. But this is a very different account of the value of life. It's not saying that life has some intrinsic value given from outside or objectively. Rather, life has a more subjective value. The value of my life is the value I give to it. If I no longer perceive that my life has value, then perhaps it's appropriate for me or permissible for me to end that life. So here we have an older paper, again from the Journal of Medical Ethics, Clark this time, noting that although suicide has traditionally carried a negative sanction in Western societies, this is now being challenged. And he notes that while there is still public concern, he's talking about older data here, but we've seen some of the public concern about at-risk groups, there's at the same time a paradoxical push to relax the prohibition under certain circumstances. And central to the arguments behind this are the principles of respect for autonomy and the idea that rationality is important, and he's hinting there that there might be such a thing as rational suicide, which Satoshi touched on. So this idea of autonomy, I'll use that language, or the language of choice most often here. Autonomy from the ancient Greek is self-rule, so it's the idea of respect for self-rule. So you can immediately detect, and it was running through much of what Satoshi discussed, there is this tension. When do we say it's life that deserves or needs to be protected, as opposed to when do we go with choice, even if the choice in question means the ending of that life? Big head scratchers. And the law itself in this jurisdiction, so I'll talk specifically here about England and Wales, also scratches its head about this question. And you'll see through the quick depiction I'll give you of the legal picture, we've moved on from policy to law now, that the law is simultaneously trying to honour both sets of values. It's trying to signal that life is important and deserves protection, whilst also signalling the importance of respecting choice. So on the side of life, we've got, for example, various mental health acts that essentially talk about protecting individuals from other individuals, or indeed from themselves. So that's one of the sets of messages there. So of course we can detain certain individuals and treat them even without their consent in some circumstances. We also have this clear prohibition on assistance in suicide or euthanasia or assisted dying. The language there fluctuates, but broadly no to helping certain patients to be assisted in their dying. And then we have the Human Rights Act. Now, I did mention a moment ago that broad Judeo-Christian framing that might underpin notions like the sanctity of human life. I would also note that, certainly in law, the Human Rights Act is a much more secular expression of the same fundamental idea. People vary on their interpretation of this, but what I'm suggesting is basically Article 2, so right at the start of this Act of Parliament that came into force in 2000, is the right to life. So a clear signal from the state that life is worthy of protection. But at the same time, particularly as we move towards the healthcare setting, which is where I'm drawing you to now, we see various pockets of the law that might be interpreted as saying that choice matters as well. So query whether there's strictly a legal right to commit suicide, I personally suspect not. I think at most there's a degree of liberty to commit suicide. As I say, we can return to that if you like. But certainly suicide is no longer prohibited since the 1961 Act of Parliament. Also, if you are an individual with what the law calls mental capacity, so the ability to think through your decision and reach that decision, then you have the right to say no to treatment, to refuse treatment, even if that treatment is life-sustaining. For other patients who lack capacity, think, for example, critically ill infants, like those who've been in the news a great deal in recent years, all the way through to older adults, perhaps those with advanced dementia, there it can still be permissible to withdraw or withhold even life-sustaining treatment in some circumstances. So the law is not entirely saying life at all costs. Rather, there are circumstances where life can be shortened, shall we say. The language immediately gets tricky here, and we might come back to that later as well. It gets even more tricky, and this is something I could talk to you about for weeks, in the whole pocket of laws dealing with the relief of symptoms in terminal illness. I'll tell you the official legal line, which is essentially an appropriate doctor can seek to relieve terminal symptoms even if what he or she does might incidentally shorten the patient's life. What I would strongly signal, and again I'd come back to this in questions if people are interested, is that principle will only be needed in the very rare case. Most often when dealing with terminal symptoms, you don't actually need to run the risk of shortening life. But that's almost a debate for another day. What I'm trying primarily to signal is there are pockets of the law that says it's not always life that has to be respected, and indeed some pockets that explicitly talk about the importance of respecting individuals' choices, particularly around suicide to some degree, but certainly the refusal of treatment. So the fact the law has both values expressed within it raises questions. Does this mean the law is in a position of conflict? Is it incoherent or inconsistent? Or is it trying appropriately to steer some sort of compromise, navigate a way through and balance out the different values? Well, let's explore where it is through these two difficult cases. And I'll explain the voting before I come to the cases. What I'll be asking you to do is vote for one of three options by a show of hands. And the three options will be 1, 2, and number 3 will always be unsure. So don't worry if you're unsure, you're allowed to vote unsure. Hopefully you will all have voted by that point, okay? And then afterwards we'll come back and see if you have any questions, comments about how you vote. And these are two cases that are very much dealing with suicide, but in very different ways. And they're real cases that were widely publicised at the time, both of them, in fact, around about 2007. So the first is the story of Carrie Walton. She was 26 years of age at the crucial moment, and she had been diagnosed with an untreatable personality disorder. Prior to the events in question, she'd attempted suicide on at least 9 occasions. Unsuccessfully, she had been treated, revived, resuscitated, and saved, some would say. But by 2007, she prepared a document I'm about to show you, and 4 days later, she deliberately consumed an overdose of antifreeze. So she consumed a poison that would certainly end her life. But she then phoned an ambulance. Okay, here's the note that the ambulance team found on encountering her. I may not read all of this in view of time, but she talks about, if I come into hospital regarding an overdose or any attempt on my life, I would like for no life-saving treatment to be given. I'm 100% aware of the consequences, and I take full responsibility for the consequences, knowing that this will end in my death. I'm aware that you may think that because I called the ambulance, I therefore want treatment. This is not the case. I do, however, want to be comfortable, as nobody wants to die alone and scared. And she then goes on to say, please don't offer me a range of life-saving treatments. These are my wishes. Please respect and carry them out. So vote number 1. Do you think, in a case like this, the staff should seek to protect life? In other words, go ahead and treat her, try and treat the symptoms of this poisoning with a view to saving her life. That's option number 1. Option number 2, respect her wishes as stated here. Or option 3, unsure. And I'm going to cheaply call those life, choice, unsure. So those of you in favour of protecting life, if you could raise your hands now, please. So that's a good smattering of hands, probably around about, I'm going to look to my beautiful assistant, Satoshi, 10 to 15, something like that? 20. 20? Lovely, thank you. Those of you who think go with her choice. That looks like more to me. We're going to call that 27. Statistically, this is robust. Unsure? Okay, so I think our biggest group is the group saying respect her choice. The second biggest group is go ahead and treat her, and the final group is the unsure. Fewer of you were unsure. Okay, thank you. I'll say a few words about this, move on, and then we'll come back, and if you wish to, we can explore why you voted as you did. So briefly to touch on some of that research I mentioned we'd done previously with the Bristol and Manchester groups, we basically were confronted by this scenario and knew it was not the only such case that clinicians in emergency departments, psychiatric settings, and in ambulances were confronting. So we undertook some research that resulted in a systematic review and led to a write-up of some focus groups involving various participants, including people themselves with histories of psychiatric treatment and or self-harm. I won't talk through all the detail on here, but I would emphasise that what we found was pretty consistent themes, both amongst the previous literature and amongst our participants. Basically, everyone recognising they're in a position of, to a degree, legal uncertainty, but certainly ethical uncertainty. In other words, this dilemma, should we go for life or choice? And you see that play out quite explicitly. These are just two examples from the participants in the focus group discussions. Both of them are paramedics. You've got, on the one hand, the one saying, when you're dealing with a situation like this, it's very much a step into the unknown, but recognising that a great deal of their ethos as ambulance workers, as healthcare professionals, is to preserve life. So that message clearly comes through, but we also have the other message coming through clearly. Indeed, the second paramedic saying, if it was crystal clear what the person's wishes were, then we would respect that patient's wishes. Does that leave you clear as to which way to go? Not necessarily. So that's case number one. You can see why I'm turning to you for the answers. Case number two, again, might be one that you saw reported in the national and indeed international media, and this comes back to a phenomenon that Satoshi mentioned, this phenomenon of individuals travelling to a jurisdiction, a country, that permits some form of assistance in dying. So for the UK, that primarily involves people travelling from the UK to Zurich, to Dignitas, the organisation in Zurich, for assistance in suicide. And one such case, same year as Carrie Walton, Daniel James, this time he's the 22-year-old who was a student and a talented rugby player who was badly injured during rugby training that left him tetraplegic, so essentially substantially paralysed and irreversibly so. By 2008, he had, again, attempted suicide on 3 occasions, but each time intervention had occurred and his life had been saved. And he contacts Dignitas. His parents and the doctors caring for him over here tried to dissuade him, and a psychiatrist assessed whether he had what I called earlier this mental capacity to say yes or no about various choices in his life. And I won't read all of it again, but the psychiatrist saying, I'm of the opinion he has full capacity to make decisions about his medical treatment, is fully aware, displays coherent, clear, logical thinking in order to arrive at a decision, and has clearly weighed the alternatives up. So following that assessment, his parents and a family friend helped him in corresponding further with Dignitas, and his parents helped him to travel to Zurich, where he was assisted in his suicide. However, given the legal picture, although the final act, the suicide or the assisted suicide, occurs in a different country, the crime over here is one of assisting or encouraging a suicide, which in theory could happen anywhere. So the acts done here to help him to travel could amount to a crime in this country. So, his parents are brought before, as is the family member, a family friend, brought before the prosecutors. The DPP, that is the Director of Public Prosecutions, ultimately decides there's enough evidence to prosecute, but it's not in the public interest to do so. So do you think that is the right way to go? In other words, put as a succinct question, should Daniel and his loved ones be legally entitled to travel to another jurisdiction for assistance in suicide? So again, if I put it very crudely, and I apologise that it is crude, if you think no to travel, you're essentially going for life. If you think yes to travel, you're going for choice. And if you're unsure, unsure. So number one, life. In other words, don't let people travel to do this. So we have a few people objecting to that there. Thank you. Those of you who think people should be free legally, with no barriers to travel, including with the help of loved ones. So that's a very clear majority, I would say. And then number three, unsure. Okay, so we have a clear majority in favour of allowing travel. I think the second biggest group is the unsure, and then those in favour of not permitting travel is life, which doesn't quite tally. There's something, for at least some of you, that's qualitatively different about these scenarios, although ultimately it looks like you're quite a pro-autonomy audience. We'll see whether that's a good thing in a moment. A couple of final slides, just briefly to say the legal picture is complicated, but we know that this is a phenomenon that has involved a great many people from the UK. It's hard to get absolutely accurate data. Dignitas might well have it, but we're talking about around about 350 people, according to the UK group Dignity in Dying, around about one Brit travelling every 8 days. The legal position I can come back to in questions if you like, but one of the things I will note, and this draws on my colleague Paul's research, is that the General Medical Council that regulates doctors over here has issued guidance on what would be lawful or unlawful for doctors to do. And one aspect of the Dignitas process is that you need a medical record or a medical report confirming your diagnosis and prognosis before Dignitas will assist you. And it has been confirmed, provided that the doctor does not intend to assist a suicide in providing the medical record, then there's unlikely to be any danger of the doctor committing a crime. And Paul has published on this in the British Journal of General Practice. I will briefly tell you one thought I've had in this regard. This is an older paper of mine from 2009. I wonder if, given that we have this big, difficult choice between essentially life or choice, I wonder if at least allowing people to travel to somewhere where this is permitted is something of an ethical compromise on this difficult question. But it is an enduring question, where the balance should be. So I'll close with the words of Charles Foster, which draws me back to Satoshi because Charles is based in Oxford, so there's a beautiful circularity to that, deliberately designed, of course. The final line he has there is, if you permit the autonomous, what he calls designer death of X, you endanger the autonomy rights of the vulnerable patients that the previous restrictive law was drafted to prevent. In other words, how do we respect choice and life simultaneously? Are there too many vulnerabilities such that we should fall back on life? Or is, as it seems you're voting, choice so important that's the direction we should go in? Thank you for listening, and with apologies for this, I think, arigato gozaimasu.